Close your eyes now, and imagine a spear that never finds its mark, an arrow that veers just slightly in the Trojan wind, and a warrior who should have fallen, but doesn't. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, stood upon the blood-soaked plains before the walls of Troy, and the arrow of Paris, meant to pierce his heel, the one vulnerable point upon his divine body, missed by the width of a breath. He felt the feather touch of it graze his skin, heard it clatter against stone behind him, and in that moment, destiny fractured. The war that should have ended with his death continued. But something changed in the air that day, something vast and irreversible, because the greatest warrior the world had ever known did not die. Instead, he lived. He turned, bewildered, touched his heel where prophecy had promised mortality, and found only the faintest scratch. The blood that welled there was red, human red, but it stopped flowing almost immediately, the wound closing as if it had never been. The Fates, those three ancient weavers, paused at their loom. A thread that should have been cut remained whole. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos looked at one another across the spinning wheel of destiny, and for the first time in the history of the cosmos, they did not know what to do. A mortal who should have died had not died. A hero who should have found his glory in death had instead found something else, something unprecedented, something that would echo across the millennia. And so begins a story not of death, but of endless life, a story that stretches across 3,000 years and more, where the hero of the Iliad walks forward into centuries he was never meant to see. Troy still fell, yes, but Achilles was there to watch it burn, to see the great horse wheeled through the Scaean gates, to hear the screams as Greek soldiers poured from its hollow belly like wasps from a disturbed nest, and to understand, with growing horror, that war never truly ends. It only changes its mask, its weapons, its justifications. This is the story of Achilles immortal, Achilles undying, Achilles who could not escape the world even when he longed for the peace of the underworld. A story told in whispers and shadows, soft as sleep, deep as time itself. A story that begins at the moment of a death that never came, and continues, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, into a present day where the ancient world has become myth and the myths have become entertainment, and the entertainment has forgotten the truth of what it means to live forever while everyone you love turns to dust. The walls of Troy collapsed in flame and ash, and Achilles stood among the ruins, his armor black with soot, his hands empty of purpose, his heart hollow with a grief that had not diminished with Hector's death. He had killed Hector. That much remained true in this altered thread of fate, had dragged the Trojan prince's body around the city walls 3 times while Hector's father King Priam watched from the battlements and wept, had wept over Patroclus, his beloved companion, his truest friend, whose death had ignited such rage within him that even the gods trembled at the force of his fury. But now the war was over, and he had not died. The prophecy had been clear. He would die young at Troy and achieve eternal glory, or he would live long and be forgotten. But this was neither. He had achieved the glory. The songs were already being sung about him around the campfires, but he had not died. The mechanism of fate had broken. The Greek ships prepared to sail home, laden with Trojan gold and Trojan women who would become slaves in Greek households, laden with the spoils of a 10-year war that had consumed a generation of men. But Achilles lingered on the beach, staring at the waters that should have carried his body back to Phthia wrapped in honor and grief. His mother Thetis rose from the waves that night, her form shimmering in the moonlight, and she looked at him with eyes that held both love and terrible knowledge. She had known this might happen. She had dipped him in the river Styx when he was an infant, had held him by the heel as the waters of immortality washed over his body, had tried to make him invulnerable. But she had also known the prophecy, had believed that the Styx's protection would not extend to the heel she had held, had believed he would die as prophesied. Now she saw that something had gone wrong, or perhaps terribly right. The waters had touched more of him than she had realized. His divine heritage, dormant until now, had been activated by the nearness of death. He was not fully immortal, but neither was he mortal any longer. He existed in the liminal space between a half-god who could not die but could still suffer, could still feel pain, could still lose everything he loved. Odysseus found him there on the beach the next morning, placed a hand upon his shoulder, and said nothing, because what words exist for a man who has outlived his own legend? What comfort can you offer someone whose story has already ended, except that he must continue living anyway? The ships departed. Achilles remained. He wandered the coast of Asia Minor for years, decades, watching the survivors of Troy scatter like seeds upon the wind, watching new settlements rise where the great city had stood, watching memory fade into myth with a speed that astonished him. Within a single generation, the children of the survivors were telling stories about Troy that bore only passing resemblance to the truth. Within 2 generations, the stories had become legend. Within 3, the legends had become songs that traveling bards sang for wine and bread, embellishing details, adding drama, transforming real people into archetypal heroes and villains. He did not age. The wound that should have killed him had instead awakened something in his blood, the divine heritage of his mother, that is, silver-footed goddess of the sea, a heritage that had always been there, dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge. He was not fully God, not like Zeus or Apollo or Athena, but no longer fully human either. He existed in the space between immortal but not invulnerable, ageless but not untouchable, forever marked by the wars he had fought and the men he had killed and the friends he had lost. He walked through the ruins of Troy often in those early years, traced the foundations of Priam's palace with his fingers, stood in the courtyard where Hector's wife Andromache had once watched her son play, sat in the spot where Patroclus had fallen, cut down by Hector's spear, and felt the weight of memory pressing upon him like a physical thing. He began to understand that immortality was not the gift the poets sang about. It was isolation. It was watching everything you knew dissolve into the past. It was being the only one who remembered the truth while everyone else lived in the comfort of stories. He left the coast eventually, traveled inland, crossed mountains and rivers whose names he did not know, and tried to outrun the past, though he knew even then that such a thing was impossible. The past was not behind him. It was inside him. It was the lens through which he saw everything. Every battlefield he passed reminded him of the Trojan plains. Every city reminded him of Troy. Every young warrior reminded him of Patroclus. He was haunted not by ghosts but by memory, and memory, he discovered, was far more persistent than any spectre. Centuries passed like the turning of pages in a book written in a language slowly being forgotten. Achilles walked south through lands that would one day be called Greece, through valleys where shepherds sang songs about a warrior named Achilles who had died at Troy, and he listened, hidden among the olive trees, to his own story being transformed into legend, into myth, into something that no longer resembled the truth of his lived experience. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes he died from an arrow to the heel shot by Paris, sometimes from treachery at a wedding, sometimes from the direct intervention of Apollo, the god who had favored Troy, sometimes from simple exhaustion after years of unrelenting combat. But always, he died. It was the ending everyone expected, the closure the story demanded. A hero must fall. A warrior must meet his fate. The narrative arc requires completion. And yet here he stood, alive and anonymous, watching the world move on without him, watching his own death be narrated 1,000 different ways by people who had never seen Troy, had never held a sword, had never watched a friend bleed out in the dust. He took new names: Philippos, Alexandros, Nikeas, simple Greek names that would not attract attention. He learned new dialects as the Greek language evolved and splintered across different regions. The Greece of his birth became something unrecognizable. City-states rose and fell. Athens grew powerful on trade and philosophy. Sparta trained its warriors in methods that borrowed from the tactics he had once used but had long since forgotten the source, transforming his innovations into tradition without knowing whose innovations they had been. He saw the Persian invasions, stood upon the cliffs at Marathon in 490 BCE and watched Greek hoplites hold the line against impossible odds, watched them fight with a courage and discipline that reminded him of the best moments of the Trojan War, felt the old fire stir in his chest, the urge to lift a sword and join the battle, to feel the weight of armor and the clarity of combat once more. But he remained still, because this was not his war, and these were not his men, and he had learned that inserting himself into conflicts only prolonged the suffering, only added his own survival to the list of things he would have to remember and regret. He had learned, slowly and painfully across the accumulating centuries, that immortality is not the gift the poets imagined. It is instead a profound loneliness, a separation from the flow of human time that makes every connection temporary, and every friendship a prelude to loss, and every love story a tragedy waiting to unfold. He traveled east, beyond the boundaries of the Greek world, into lands where his name meant nothing and his deeds were unknown, where the stories of Troy had never penetrated and the gods he had known were replaced by different gods with different demands. He crossed the mountains of Persia, walked the roads of India, saw the rise of empires whose founders had never heard of Agamemnon or Odysseus or the 10-year war that had defined his existence and shaped the early mythology of the Mediterranean world. In these distant places, he began to understand something fundamental about human nature, that war is eternal, that the reasons change but the bloodshed remains constant, that every generation believes its conflicts are unique and meaningful and different from all the wars that came before, and every generation is wrong. The causes change, the weapons evolve, the uniforms and languages and battle cries transform, but the essential nature of war remains identical. Men fight, men die, cities burn, women weep, children are orphaned, and the survivors tell stories that justify the suffering and transform the carnage into something meaningful, something purposeful, something other than the waste it actually is. He saw Alexander, centuries after Troy, marching east with dreams of conquest that mirrored his own youthful ambitions, saw the young Macedonian king leading his armies across the known world with the same certainty that had once filled Achilles' own heart, the same hunger for glory that transcends death, the same beautiful, terrible mistake of believing that fame can outlast mortality. that songs can preserve essence, that being remembered is the same as being alive. He did not introduce himself. What would he say? I am Achilles, the hero you claim to emulate, and I have learned that glory fades faster than you imagine, that songs become whispers, become silence, that even the gods grow distant and silent as the centuries accumulate like dust on abandoned altars. Instead, he watched from the edges of Alexander's army, saw the young king weep at what he believed was Achilles' tomb at Troy, saw him pay honors to a memory, to a story, to an idea of heroism that had only tenuous connection to the reality of who Achilles had been. And Achilles felt something he had not expected to feel, gratitude that he was remembered at all, even incorrectly, even as a ghost, even as a symbol rather than a person. The centuries continued their relentless march. Rome rose from mud and ambition, built roads that stretched across continents, created an empire that believed itself eternal, that inscribed its permanence in stone and lore and language, and Achilles walked those roads, just another traveler among thousands, his bronze armor long since traded for simpler clothes, his weapons buried in earth that had forgotten their sharpness, his fame reduced to stories that fewer and fewer people knew or cared about. He was in Rome when it fell, not the first time, when Alaric and his Visigoths breached the walls in 410 CE, but later, in the slow collapse that historians would argue about for millennia, the gradual dissolution that took place over decades and centuries as the great machine of empire ground to a halt. He watched the aqueducts crumble, saw the forums that had once hosted the greatest orators and philosophers of the age emptied of their scholars and filled instead with merchants selling fragments of marble stolen from temples, felt the great organizing principle of Roman civilization fading away not with a dramatic explosion, but with a tired, exhausted sigh. He had seen this before. Troy had fallen the same way, not really because of a wooden horse, though that made for a better story, a more satisfying narrative, but because the people inside the walls had grown weary of fighting, weary of sacrifice, weary of believing that their struggles mattered, weary of the vigilance required to maintain a civilization under siege. Every empire, he realized, dies of exhaustion long before the enemy breaks through the gates. The barbarians who sack the city are merely claiming a corpse. The real death happened earlier, quieter, in the hearts of citizens who stopped believing in the future. The world grew darker for a time, or perhaps it only seemed that way because the light of Rome had burned so bright that its absence felt like blindness. He moved north, into the forests of Germania, into lands where tribal warriors painted their faces blue and worshipped gods whose names were harsh and guttural and whose demands were written in blood and battle. And he remembered the simplicity of his own youth, before Troy, before fame, when the world was smaller and battles were fought for reasons you could see and touch. Cattle raids and border disputes and personal honor rather than abstract concepts like destiny and glory and the will of the gods. He took a wife once, in a village whose name has been lost to time, swallowed by the centuries like so many other small places that never made it into the history books. Her name was Hildegard. She was the daughter of a blacksmith. She had red hair and green eyes and a laugh that reminded him of Briseis, the Trojan woman he had claimed as a prize during the war, the woman he had grown to love despite the circumstances of their meeting, the woman who had been taken from him by Agamemnon in the dispute that had led to his withdrawal from battle and ultimately to Patroclus's death. He loved Hildegard for the brief span of her human life, married her in a ceremony conducted by a Christian priest, though he did not believe in the new god, and she did not know he had once known the old gods personally, built a home with her in the forest, had children with her, 3 daughters who carried his blood but not his immortality, who aged normally while he remained unchanging. He watched his daughters grow, watched them marry and have children of their own, watched Hildegard age from a vibrant young woman to a grandmother with silver hair and a back bent from decades of labor, held her hand as she died in their bed at the age of 67, surrounded by children and grandchildren who did not understand why their father looked younger than some of them. He buried her beneath an oak tree and carved no name upon the grave because names, he had learned, only invite questions he could not answer. He left the village the next year, could not bear to watch his daughters age and die as well, and vowed never to take another wife, never to love anything temporary again, because the pain of it was too vast, too consuming, too reminiscent of Patroclus and the grief that had nearly destroyed him at Troy. The centuries blurred. Time became less linear, more like a river with eddies and currents that sometimes brought the past rushing back into the present with startling clarity. He was present, though he did not know it at the time, in the audiences when Greek plays were performed in medieval monasteries, comedies and tragedies that had survived the collapse of Rome, works by Sophocles and Euripides and others whose names had been lost, and some of these plays featured characters named Achilles, portrayed him as proud, as angry, as doomed by his own excellence and his refusal to accept Dishna. He watched actors in masks portray him, watched them declaim his rage at Agamemnon, watched them lament over Patroclus's body, and thought that perhaps they were not entirely wrong, though they had never known the man, only the outline of his story, the narrative shape rather than the lived reality. He saw the spread of Christianity, watched it transform from a persecuted mystery cult meeting in catacombs and secret rooms into the official religion of empires, saw temples to Zeus and Apollo and Athena and his own mother Thetis abandoned and converted into churches, saw the old gods rebranded as demons or forgotten entirely, felt the divine presence that had once permeated the Mediterranean world recede into silence or absence or whatever realm the gods inhabited when they were no longer worshipped. He did not know if they had died or simply stopped caring about human affairs, but he felt their absence like a weight lifted from the world, a weight he had not realized was there until it was gone. The gods had been capricious and demanding, had played with human lives the way children play with toys, had started the Trojan War over a golden apple and a beauty contest and wounded pride. Their absence was liberating, in a way. It meant that the suffering of the world was now purely human-created. There was no one else to blame. No divine plans to justify the carnage. Just humans making choices and living with the consequences. The Crusades brought war back to the lands near Troy, knights in heavy armor marching east to reclaim Jerusalem from the Saracens who had held it for centuries, and Achilles traveled with them for a time, not as a warrior but as a chronicler, a scribe who claimed to be recording the deeds of heroes for posterity. He watched and recorded, though his records were lost to fire in a monastery outside Constantinople when the Fourth Crusade went terribly wrong and Christian soldiers sacked a Christian city. He saw the city that had once been Byzantium, saw its great walls that put even Troy's walls to shame, saw its domed churches and its libraries filled with preserved classical texts, and remembered when these lands were younger and wilder, when Troy stood proud and unaware of its coming doom, when he had been young and certain and convinced that glory was worth any price, that dying young in battle was preferable to growing old in obscurity. He knew better now. Obscurity was not so bad. Obscurity was peaceful. Obscurity meant you could walk through the world without the weight of expectation, without people looking to you for answers or leadership or heroism. The Renaissance arrived like a sunrise after a long night, and suddenly everyone wanted to remember the classical world, wanted to read Homer and Virgil in the original Greek and Latin, wanted to paint scenes from the Trojan War with modern faces and Renaissance clothing and impossible architecture that mixed ancient and contemporary elements without concern for historical accuracy. Achilles walked through Florence, through Rome, through Venice, and saw himself immortalized in marble and oil paint. Saw artists who had never held a sword try to capture the essence of his rage and his grief, and some of them, a very few, came close to the truth. Botticelli painted him dragging Hector's body around Troy's walls, and somehow captured the emptiness of revenge, the way violence fails to fill the void left by loss. Titian painted him among the daughters of Lycomedes, the period when his mother had hidden him, disguised as a girl, trying to prevent him from going to Troy, and captured something of the tension between destiny and desire, between who we are expected to be and who we choose to become. He stood before these paintings, before the works of masters whose names would outlast kingdoms, and felt a strange kinship with these artists who also tried to make something permanent in a world of constant change. They painted on canvas that would eventually decay. They carved marble that would eventually erode. But the act of creation itself, the attempt to capture truth or beauty or meaning, that was its own form of immortality, perhaps more genuine than his enforced continuation. He learned to read and write in a dozen new languages, Latin and Italian and French and English and German and Spanish, filled journals with observations about the changing world, about the way warfare evolved from bronze swords to iron swords to steel swords to crossbows to longbows to firearms to cannons that could breach any wall Troy's builders might have constructed, about the way human nature remained constant even as everything else transformed. The printing press arrived, and suddenly knowledge could spread faster than rumor. Books multiplied like seeds in fertile soil, and Achilles read everything he could find, philosophy and science and history and poetry, trying to understand the world he had been forced to remain within, trying to find some framework that made sense of immortality. He read Homer's Iliad in translation, read the poem that had immortalized his deeds and his rage, read accounts of the Trojan War written by men who had never seen Troy, who had never felt the weight of armor in the Mediterranean heat, who had never watched a friend die in the dust or smelled the particular stench of a battlefield where men and horses rot together under the sun. He found their versions both accurate and impossibly distant, like looking at his own reflection in water disturbed by wind. The events were correct, more or less, but the meaning was wrong, or at least incomplete. Homer had made him too simple, too angry, too certain. The real Achilles had been complicated, confused, grieving, human in ways the hero of the Iliad never quite managed to be. The age of exploration sent ships across oceans to lands the ancient Greeks had never imagined existed, and Achilles sailed with them, driven by the same restlessness that had sent him to Troy so many centuries before, the same inability to remain still, the same need to see what lay beyond the horizon. He saw the Americas, walked among civilizations that had risen and fallen without any knowledge of Greece or Rome or the wars that had shaped the Mediterranean world, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that his story was not universal, that there were entire hemispheres of human experience that had unfolded without any reference to Troy or Achilles or the heroes of the Iliad. It was humbling. It was liberating. He spent decades among the indigenous peoples of the New World, learned their languages, heard their stories of heroes and tricksters and gods and world-creating spirits, and recognized the same patterns, the same archetypes, the same human need to make sense of chaos through narrative, to transform random suffering into meaningful struggle, to believe that the world operates according to some principle other than mere chance. The stories were different in their details but identical in their function. Every culture had its Achilles, its proud warrior who excelled in combat but struggled with authority. Every culture had its Odysseus, its clever survivor who used wits rather than strength. Every culture had its Troy, its great conflict that defined a generation and echoed through the centuries in story and song. He was there when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, saw the devastation they brought, the diseases that killed millions who had no immunity, the weapons that gave Europeans an insurmountable advantage, the certainties that allowed them to justify conquest and slavery and cultural destruction as divine mission. He remembered how the Greeks had brought similar devastation to Troy, had killed the men and enslaved the women and burned the temples, had called it glory and destiny and the will of the gods. The justifications changed. Christianity instead of Greek polytheism, but the underlying reality remained the same. The strong took what they wanted from the weak and invented reasons why this was just, or necessary, or ordained by powers greater than themselves. He fought alongside the Aztec warriors at Tenochtitlan in 1521. Anonymously, another foreign mercenary in a city full of strangers, used the combat skills he had refined over 3,000 years to hold a section of the causeway for 3 days against Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces, watched the city that had reminded him of Troy in its grandeur and complexity fall to siege and disease and superior technology. And when the city finally fell, when the canals ran red with blood and the temples burned and the survivors stumbled through ruins looking for their dead, he walked away into the jungle and did not look back, because he had seen enough cities fall to last 1,000 lifetimes, and each one reminded him that he had been complicit in this pattern, had been one of the Greeks who destroyed Troy, had blood on his hands that no amount of time could wash away. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world more dramatically than any war he had witnessed. Machines that could do the work of 100 men, cities that grew like humus, swallowing farmland and forest, smokestacks that darkened the sky with coal smoke and blocked out the stars he had navigated by as a young man sailing to Troy, and Achilles, who had been born in an age of bronze and muscle and horse-drawn chariots, stood in Manchester and London and New York and tried to comprehend a world powered by steam and coal and the relentless hunger for progress. He worked in factories for a time, felt the rhythm of machines replace the rhythm of seasons, saw workers ground down by the same inexorable forces that had once ground down soldiers in endless wars, and understood that humanity had found new ways to consume itself, new methods of destruction that did not require swords or spears, that could happen slowly over years in unsafe conditions and poverty wages, that could kill you just as surely as a Trojan arrow, but without the glory or the songs. The American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the wars of unification and dissolution that reshaped Europe. He watched them all with the weary recognition of someone who has seen the same play performed with different actors and slightly altered dialogue, but always the same ending, always the same widows and orphans and veterans with haunted eyes. He was in the trenches of World War One, walked through the mud of the Somme, saw young men die in ways that made the brutality of Troy seem almost clean and honorable by comparison. Poison gas that burned lungs from the inside, artillery barrages that reduced human bodies to fragments scattered across cratered landscapes, machine guns that turned advancing infantry into mowed wheat. And he wept for the first time in centuries, because this was not glory, this was not heroism, this was merely industrial slaughter dressed in the language of patriotism and duty and national honor. He had believed once that war could be noble, that there was meaning in combat, that dying well in battle was the highest achievement a man could aspire to. World War One destroyed that belief completely. There was no dying well in those trenches. There was only dying. Pointlessly. Wholesale. Millions of men feeding themselves into a meat grinder over borders and treaties and alliances that most of them did not understand and none of them had chosen. He carried wounded from no man's land, ignored bullets that passed through him, wounds that would have killed anyone else but which his half-divine body healed from within hours, brought dying boys back to field hospitals where they could spend their last moments somewhere dry, somewhere with light, somewhere other than the mud that swallowed so many of them without trace or ceremony. The war ended. The survivors went home. The dead remained in fields that would become cemeteries, row upon row of white crosses and stone markers, and Achilles walked among those graves and thought about the tomb that had been built for him at Troy, the monument that commemorated a death that had never occurred, and wondered if perhaps he should have died, if perhaps the prophecy had been correct and the world would have been better served by his absence than by his endless, useless continuation. He did not fight in World War II, had learned by then that his participation changed nothing, that wars would come regardless of whether the greatest warrior of the ancient world lent his sword to the cause, that his presence on a battlefield might save a few individual lives but would not alter the larger patterns, would not address the root causes, would not prevent the next war from emerging as soon as this one ended. Instead, he worked in refugee camps, helped displaced persons find shelter and food, carried children across borders when their parents had been killed or separated, and tried, in his small anonymous way, to reduce the suffering that humans seemed so determined to inflict upon each other. He was in Hiroshima 3 days after the atomic bomb fell, walked through streets turned to ash, saw shadows burned into walls where people had stood the moment before they were vaporized by heat beyond imagining, saw survivors wandering with skin hanging from their arms in sheets, looking for water, looking for family, looking for any remaining fragment of the world that had existed 3 days earlier, and understood that humanity had finally achieved the power the gods had once wielded, the power to end the world with a gesture, to unmake creation, to turn cities into memories in the span of a heartbeat. It terrified him more than anything he had experienced in 3,000 years of life. He had seen cities burn before. Troy had burned. Rome had burned. Tenochtitlan had burned. But those fires had been human scale. Comprehensible. You could see the people setting the fires. You could understand the process. This was different. This was apocalyptic. This was the kind of destruction that should require gods, not humans. And yet humans had done it, had split the atom, had harnessed the sun's fire, had created weapons that made all previous warfare look like children playing with sticks. The Cold War followed, the space race, the digital revolution, and the world accelerated beyond anything he could have imagined in his youth, when the distance between Greece and Troy had seemed vast and the journey had taken weeks of sailing along coastlines because no one dared venture into the open sea. Now humans could cross that distance in hours, could communicate instantly across the globe through networks of copper and fiber optics and satellites orbiting the Earth, could access the sum of human knowledge with devices small enough to hold in one hand. Devices that held more information than the Library of Alexandria had contained at its height. He learned to use computers, to navigate the internet, to watch videos of the Trojan War depicted in Hollywood films with actors who looked nothing like the real Hector or Agamemnon or himself, who fought with choreographed moves designed to look good on camera rather than to kill efficiently, who delivered speeches written by screenwriters who had never held a weapon or watched someone die. He created email accounts under false names, participated in online forums about ancient Greece, and occasionally, carefully, corrected misconceptions about the Trojan War, though no one ever believed his corrections came from personal experience, dismissing him as just another amateur historian with strong opinions and too much time. He watched the internet transform from a tool used by researchers and academics into a global phenomenon that changed how humans related to each other, how they consumed information, how they understood truth. And he saw in this transformation echoes of the printing press, of writing itself, of every technological shift that had changed how knowledge was stored and transmitted. The medium changed. The human needs remained constant. People still told stories, still argued about the meaning of history, still tried to make sense of their lives by reference to the past, still needed heroes and villains and narratives that transformed chaos into pattern. He returned to the site of Troy in the early 21st century, stood among the archaeological ruins that German and Turkish and American teams had excavated over the past century and a half, looked at the carefully labeled layers, Troy 1 through Troy 9, each civilization built upon the ruins of the last, each generation building literally on top of the failures of their ancestors, and tried to remember which layer corresponded to his Troy, his war, his youth. The archaeologists had it wrong, he thought. Or not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. They had found Troy 7a, had declared it the most likely candidate for Homeric Troy based on evidence of destruction by fire around 1200 BCE. They were close, but they did not know what it had felt like. They had excavated the bones, but not the flesh. The layout of streets, but not the sounds that filled them. The foundations of temples, but not the prayers spoken within them. The landscape had changed beyond recognition. The coastline had shifted. Millennia of sediment from the Scamander River had pushed the sea miles away from where it had been when Greek ships beached on Trojan sand. The rivers had moved. Watersheds had changed. The great walls he remembered, walls that had seemed impossibly high when he was young, were reduced to foundation stones barely reaching his waist. Tourists walked past him snapping photographs, families with children eating ice cream and complaining about the heat, students sketching the ruins for architecture classes, tour guides explaining in a dozen languages that this was where Achilles had fought, where Hector had died, where Helen's beauty had launched 1,000 ships. And none of them could imagine that the war they had read about in Homer had been real, had been bloody and desperate and far less poetic than the hexameter verses suggested. None of them knew that the great hero Achilles was standing among them, old baseball cap pulled low, camera around his neck like any other tourist, listening to them recite the story of his death. He sat on a stone that might have been part of the wall he had helped breach, or might have been from a completely different era, from one of the other Troys that had risen and fallen on this windswept hill, and felt the weight of memory pressing down upon him like a physical force. Every person he had known was dust. Every certainty he had held was obsolete. Every value he had fought for had been reinterpreted or discarded. The gods were gone or silent. The meaning he had ascribed to his own suffering had been rewritten 1,000 times by people who had not been there, who had not earned the right to interpretation through lived experience. And yet, he remained. A ghost haunting his own history. A footnote that had outlived the text. He watched the sun set over the Dardanelles, watched the sky turn the same bronze red it had been the night before the final assault on Troy, watched the light fade from the water the way it had faded 3,000 years earlier, when he had stood in almost this exact spot, younger then, more certain, preparing for battle with Patroclus at his side, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of continuity, of connection, of belonging to a story larger than himself even. If that story had moved on without him, even if his role in that story had been reduced to symbol and myth. The 21st century brought new wars, fought with drones and cyber attacks and economic sanctions, wars where soldiers in Nevada controlled robots in Afghanistan through satellite links, killing people they never saw with precision-guided missiles while drinking coffee in air-conditioned trailers. Wars that rarely involved soldiers meeting face-to-face on a battlefield, the kind of personal combat he had once understood, where you looked into the eyes of the man you killed and carried that weight forever. He watched conflicts unfold on television screens and computer monitors. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Ukraine. Saw cities destroyed by artillery and airstrikes. Saw refugees fleeing in numbers that dwarfed the displacement caused by the Trojan War. Millions of people driven from their homes by violence and famine and climate change, and recognized the same patterns of human behavior, the same justifications, the same certainty on all sides that their cause was righteous and their enemies were monsters deserving of destruction. He volunteered with humanitarian organizations, worked in refugee camps along the Turkish-Syrian border, not far from where Troy had once stood, completing a circle he had not intended but which felt somehow appropriate, helped families who had lost everything to wars they had not chosen and did not understand, was started by politicians and generals they had never met, was justified by ideologies and grievances that meant nothing to them. He did not tell them he had been a warrior once. He did not tell them he had helped destroy a city, not unlike the ones they had fled. He did not tell them that their suffering reminded him of the Trojan women he had seen enslaved, the children he had seen orphaned, the old men he had seen killed trying to defend homes they had lived in for 70 years. He simply helped, carried water in jerry cans from distribution points to family tents, distributed blankets and tarps when winter came and the camps flooded with mud, listened to their stories, which were all different in their details but identical in their essential shape. We had a life, and then the war came, and now we have nothing. At night, alone in his tent, he wrote in journals he knew no one would ever read, tried to make sense of immortality, tried to answer the question that had haunted him for 3,000 years. What is the purpose of a life that never ends? Is there meaning in continuation itself? Or does meaning require conclusion, the finality of death that gives shape to a life and allows it to be understood as a complete narrative rather than an endless, shapeless accumulation of moments? He had no answer. Or perhaps he had too many answers, each contradictory, each true in its own way. Perhaps meaning was not something you found, but something you created through action and choice. Perhaps immortality was not a gift or a curse, but simply a condition, neutral in itself, made meaningful or meaningless by how you chose to live within it. Perhaps the purpose of remembering Troy and Patroclus and all the people he had loved and lost was not to preserve some abstract historical truth, but to honor their brief existences by carrying them forward, by refusing to let them be forgotten completely, by making their temporary sparks of consciousness into something that approached immortality through his continued remembrance. He thought often of Patroclus, of the friend he had loved more than life itself, of the companion who had understood him in ways no one else ever had, of the rage and grief that had consumed him when Patroclus died, when Hector's spear had pierced his chest and Achilles had arrived too late to save him, had been sulking in his tent over a wounded pride so petty in retrospect that he could hardly believe it had seemed important. He had avenged Patroclus, had killed Hector, had mutilated the Trojan prince's body in ways that shamed him now when he allowed himself to remember, had sacrificed Trojan prisoners on Patroclus's funeral pyre, had won the war, and none of it had brought Patroclus back. None of it had filled the void. Revenge was supposed to provide closure, satisfaction, a sense of balance restored. Instead, it had merely added guilt to grief, had given him more deaths to remember, more faces to see when he closed his eyes, more weight to carry through the centuries. He wondered if perhaps mortality was the gift and immortality the curse, because nothing could hurt him the way that loss had hurt him if he never allowed himself to love anything temporary again. But isolation was its own kind of death, a slow erosion of the self, a gradual transformation from person into thing, from human into monument. He had tried it, had spent centuries avoiding human connection, and had found it unbearable. Better to love and lose than to become so calcified by self-protection that you lost the capacity to feel anything at all. So he lived in the tension between connection and loss, allowed himself friendships that would inevitably end, allowed himself to care about people and causes and places even though he knew he would outlive them all. Because the alternative was to become something inhuman, something carved from stone, something that only resembled Achilles but had forgotten what it meant to feel, to suffer, to hope, to grieve. He walked through cities at night. New York and Tokyo and Mumbai and Lagos and Sao Paulo, cities of millions, populations larger than all the people who had lived during the entire Bronze Age combined, and felt both invisible and deeply seen, because everyone was too busy with their own lives to notice him, and yet their lives, in aggregate, were the only thing that gave his continued existence meaning. He was a witness, a recorder, a keeper of stories, not because anyone had asked him to be, not because he believed the stories mattered in any cosmic sense, but because remembering was the only purpose he had found that felt true, that felt worthy of continuation, that justified the burden of immortality. Climate change became the dominant narrative of the era, scientists warning that human activity was altering the planet in ways that could make it uninhabitable, politicians arguing about solutions while the ice caps melted and the seas rose and the weather patterns grew increasingly chaotic and destructive, droughts and floods and hurricanes of unprecedented intensity. Achilles, who had lived through the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Black Death, and 2 world wars, recognized the signs of civilizational transition, the desperate clinging to old certainties, the denial in the face of overwhelming evidence, the hope that somehow the crisis would resolve itself without requiring sacrifice or change, without demanding that people alter the comfortable patterns that had led to catastrophe. He had seen it before. Troy had been warned. Cassandra had prophesied the city's fall. The Trojans had not listened. Rome had been warned. The emperors had seen the barbarian migrations, the economic collapse, the military defeats. They had not changed course. Every civilization believes it is too important to fail, too exceptional to follow the pattern of all the civilizations that came before. Every civilization is wrong. He joined environmental organizations, planted trees in deforested regions of the Amazon and Southeast Asia, participated in beach cleanups and rewilding projects and efforts to protect endangered species, not because he believed these small actions would solve the problem, which was systemic and would require transformations in how humans organized their economies and societies, but because action was better than despair, and despair was the one enemy he had never learned to defeat. Despair was the voice that whispered that nothing mattered, that all effort was futile, that the cycles would continue regardless of individual choices. Despair was the temptation to give up, to stop caring, to let the world burn because it had always burned and would always burn. He resisted despair the way he had once resisted Trojan spears, with stubborn, irrational persistence, with the simple decision to keep trying even when trying seemed pointless. He thought about the world that would exist after this civilization fell, because it would fall. He was certain of that, having seen it happen again and again, and wondered if perhaps his immortality had a purpose after all. To witness, to remember, to carry the stories forward into whatever came next, to be the continuity between what was and what would be. He had been, in a sense, doing this all along, carrying Troy forward through the centuries, keeping alive the memory of people who had died 3,000 years ago. Hector and Priam and Briseis and Andromache and Patroclus, giving them a kind of immortality through his continued remembrance even though their names had become symbols and stories rather than people, even though the living reality of who they had been lost to time and all that remained was the outline, the narrative shape, the myth. He learned new technologies as they emerged, artificial intelligence and virtual reality and genetic engineering and quantum computing, watched humanity reach toward powers that seemed almost godlike in their scope and potential, watched them grasp at abilities the gods of his youth had wielded, the power to know all things, to be present everywhere simultaneously, to reshape the fundamental building blocks of life itself, to transcend the limitations of human biology. And he watched them make the same mistakes the gods had made, confusing power with wisdom, capability with understanding, the ability to do something with the wisdom to know whether it should be done. The gods had been powerful but not wise. They had shaped human destiny through caprice and jealousy and petty grudges. They had started wars over golden apples. They had destroyed cities because their pride had been wounded. They had treated human lives as toys, as entertainment, as means to ends that served only divine amusement. Now humans had that power, and they were proving themselves just as capricious, just as short-sighted, just as willing to use godlike abilities in service of ungodlike ends. He created digital archives of his memories, taught himself programming and encryption, stored files across distributed networks and backup servers in multiple countries, not because he feared dying, though he sometimes hoped for it, hoped that some new technology or catastrophe might finally end what the arrow of Paris had failed to finish, but because he feared forgetting. 3,000 years was too long for human memory. Details slipped away. Faces blurred. Conversations he had once remembered word for word became vague impressions. He was losing Troy, losing Patroclus, losing the texture of his own past even as he continued forward through time. The digital archives were an attempt to externalize memory, to preserve what his mind could no longer hold, to create a backup of himself that might survive even if he did not. He participated in virtual recreations of ancient battles, saw the Trojan War rendered in video games and simulations, saw players control characters named Achilles and Hector, saw them die and respawn and die again in an endless loop, and felt a strange vertigo, because this was both completely accurate and completely wrong. The endless repetition of combat, the reduction of individuals to game pieces, the transformation of sacred violence into entertainment. Yes, this captured something true about war. But the respawning, the resurrection, the ability to try again without consequences, this missed the essential truth of mortality, which was that death mattered because it was final, because you only got one chance, because the stakes were absolute. He played these games sometimes, controlled the avatar of Achilles, and was always struck by how simplified the choices were. Fight or flee, attack or defend, victory or defeat. The real war had been infinitely more complex. The real choices had involved moral ambiguities and competing loyalties and uncertainty about what was right. But games required clear objectives, required winners and losers, required meaning that the real war had lacked. The COVID pandemic arrived in 2020, and Achilles, who had lived through the plague of Athens and the Antonine Plague and the Black Death and the Spanish flu, recognized the familiar patterns of fear and denial and solidarity and fracture that emerged when invisible death moved through populations like wind through wheat. He worked in hospitals, helped where he could, volunteered in ICUs when staff were overwhelmed and dying themselves from the virus they were trying to treat, watched people die alone because their families could not visit, because the risk of transmission was too great, watched healthcare workers exhaust themselves caring for strangers, working double shifts, sleeping in their cars to avoid infecting their own families, breaking down in supply closets when the weight of it all became too much. He watched society fracture along familiar fault lines, saw some people sacrifice for the common good while others insisted their individual freedom mattered more than collective safety, saw the same debates that had raged during every previous plague, the same tensions between public health and personal liberty, the same conspiracy theories about the disease being a hoax or a weapon or divine punishment. And he saw both the worst and best of human nature on display simultaneously. The cruelty of people who refused to mask or vaccinate even as hospitals overflowed, and the compassion of neighbors who delivered groceries to the elderly, who checked on the isolated, who found ways to maintain human connection across the barriers of quarantine. He contracted the virus himself, felt the fever and the exhaustion and the sensation of drowning as his lungs filled with fluid, and wondered, briefly, if this might be the thing that finally killed him, if mortality could arrive not through violence as prophecy had suggested but through microscopic biology, a virus that did not care about divine heritage or ancient prophecies or the will of the fates. But he recovered. His body, sustained by whatever divine inheritance flowed through his veins, fought off the disease and emerged intact. He was not surprised. He had stopped being surprised by his own survival centuries ago. Survival was the default. Survival was the curse. The world emerged from lockdown changed, more digital, more isolated, more aware of its fragility, and Achilles recognized another layer of transformation, another scar added to human civilization, another story that would be told and retold until it became myth, until people who had not lived through it would find it hard to believe, would think surely it could not have been that bad, would minimize the suffering the way every generation minimized the suffering of previous generations. Because that was how humans coped with history, by creating distance, by transforming trauma into narrative. He had watched the Trojan War undergo the same transformation, from lived horror to noble epic, and knew the pandemic would follow the same trajectory. The pain would fade, the stories would simplify, and eventually, people would remember only the outline, the shape, the myth rather than the reality. He thought about the future often now, not because he believed he had any control over it, but because the present had become somehow more tenuous, more uncertain, balanced on the edge of possibilities both transcendent and catastrophic, humanity standing at a crossroads with one path leading to extinction and the other to transformation into something that might not be recognizably human anymore. Space exploration had resumed in earnest. Private companies and nations racing to establish bases on the Moon and Mars, planning missions to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, designing generation ships that could carry humans to other star systems across voyages lasting centuries. And he wondered if humanity would carry its wars to the stars, or if the vastness of space might finally teach the humility that Earth had failed to instill. He imagined cities on distant planets, colonies spreading across the solar system and beyond, humans adapting to different gravities and atmospheres, evolution diverging as populations separated by light years followed different trajectories, and tried to picture himself among them, still walking forward through time, still witnessing, still remembering, carrying the memory of Troy and Athens and Rome, and all the civilizations that had risen and fallen on this single blue planet into a future among the stars. Would he go? If humanity left Earth, would he leave with them? Or would he stay, anchored to the soil that held the bones of everyone he had ever loved, unable to sever the connection even as the living moved on to new worlds with new challenges and new mistakes to make? He did not know. He supposed he would make that decision when the time came, as he had made all his decisions, moment by moment, century by century, trying to find meaning in a life that had outlasted meaning's usual time frame, trying to maintain some sense of purpose when purpose required direction and direction required destination, and he had no destination except forward, always forward, through time that flowed like a river he could not leave. He watched the development of artificial intelligence with particular interest. Watched machines learn to recognize patterns and make decisions and generate text and images that could fool humans into thinking they had been created by humans. Watched the boundary between human and machine creativity blur and dissolve, and wondered if perhaps this was how the gods had felt. Watching humans develop agriculture and writing and mathematics and all the other technologies that had allowed them to reshape the world. The gods had been made obsolete by human capability. Now humans were creating their own successors, artificial minds that could think faster and remember better and process more information than any biological brain. He was not afraid of the machines. He had learned to stop fearing change. Change was the only constant. The world he had been born into was gone. The world he inhabited now would also pass. And whatever world came next would also transform into something unrecognizable. The machines were just another step in the endless process of transformation. Whether they destroyed humanity or elevated it or merged with it into some hybrid post-human civilization, that remained to be seen. But he would be there to witness it. He was always there. That was his curse and his purpose. To witness, to remember, to carry forward. He walked the beaches where he had first learned to fight, where his mother had held him as a child, her feet never quite touching the sand, always at home in the border between land and sea, always belonging to both worlds and neither. The Mediterranean had not changed as much as the land. The water still moved in the same rhythms, still tasted of salt and distance, still held the memories of everyone who had ever crossed it or drowned in it or loved it, still connected the lands around it the way it had for millennia. He stood at the water's edge and watched the sun rise over the horizon, the same sun that had risen over Troy 3,000 years ago, the same sun that had illuminated Hector's face as they fought for the last time. As Achilles drove his spear through the gap in Hector's armor and watched the life drain from the eyes of a man he had respected even as he killed him. The same sun that had shone on Patroclus's body as Achilles wept over it and vowed revenge that had proven hollow and insufficient and had not brought back what had been lost. The sun did not care about human stories. It simply rose and set, measuring time in a way that made even his immortal lifespan seem brief and insignificant. The sun had witnessed the birth of life on Earth, had watched species emerge and evolve and go extinct, had seen continents drift apart and come together, had illuminated empires that rose and fell and were forgotten so completely that not even their names survived. Troy was nothing to the sun. Rome was nothing. All of human civilization was nothing, a brief flash of light in the cosmic darkness, and his own 3,000 years were less than nothing, a fraction of the sun's existence. He found this perspective comforting rather than nihilistic. It meant that his failures did not matter as much as he feared. It meant that the weight he carried, the guilt over Hector and the prisoners he had sacrificed and the cities he had helped destroy, was significant in human terms but cosmically irrelevant. The universe did not care. The sun would rise whether he was burdened by memory or free of it. He was 77 years old when he went to Troy, young by modern standards, impossibly young by the standards of his own long life, a mere boy playing at warfare though he had been the greatest warrior of his generation. He had lived more than 3,000 years since then, had watched empires rise and fall, had seen technologies emerge that would have seemed like magic to his younger self, had loved and lost and learned and forgotten and remembered again. And still, he carried Troy within him. Still he felt the weight of the armor he had worn. Still he heard Patroclus's voice calling his name across the centuries. Still he remembered the exact shade of red the sky had turned as the city burned, the smell of smoke and blood and the sea wind carrying it all away. He could not escape his own past. It was inside him. It was the foundation on which every subsequent experience had been built. He was not Achilles who happened to have fought at Troy. He was Troy's Achilles, forever defined by a war that had ended before most of human history had even begun, forever shaped by choices made when he was young and certain and convinced that glory mattered more than life. He knew better now. But knowing better did not change what had happened, did not bring back the dead, did not undo the suffering. It only gave him perspective, the ability to see his own story as one among billions, his own suffering as universal rather than unique, his own continuation as neither blessed nor cursed but simply as existence, neutral and ongoing, a thread that had not been cut still weaving through the loom of time. The present moment finds him in a small apartment in Athens, anonymous among millions, writing these thoughts in journals both physical and digital, documenting a life that has exceeded all reasonable boundaries, all expected conclusions, all narrative satisfactions. The city outside his window is modern and ancient simultaneously, the Acropolis visible in the distance, crowned with monuments to gods who have not answered prayers in millennia, temples to deities who were already old when he was young, the streets filled with people living their brief, bright lives, unaware that among them walks a man who remembers when these streets did not exist, when Athens was a minor settlement rather than a great city, when the Parthenon was not yet imagined and the gods it would honor were still active participants in human affairs. He does not know what the future holds. No one does, immortal or otherwise. He does not know if humanity will survive the challenges it has created for itself, the climate change that threatens to make vast regions uninhabitable, the nuclear weapons that could end civilization in an afternoon, the artificial intelligence that might transcend and replace human consciousness, the pandemics and the wars and the endless cycles of violence that seem impossible to break. He does not know if he will still be here to witness what comes next, or if somehow, finally, after 3,000 years of defying prophecy and fate and the natural order of mortal existence, he will find the ending that was stolen from him at Troy, the death that Paris's arrow was meant to deliver but failed to. But for now, in this moment, as the sun sets over Athens and the ancient stones of the Acropolis turn golden in the fading light, he is here. He breathes. He remembers. He carries forward the stories of people who have been dead for 3 millennia, gives them continued life through his continued existence, makes their brief sparks of mortality into something that approaches immortality through the simple act of refusing to forget, through the deliberate choice to remember their names and faces and voices even when everyone else has reduced them to symbols and archetypes. Hector was not just the Trojan prince. He was a man who loved his wife and son, who fought to protect his city, who knew he was going to die and fought anyway. Patroclus was not just Achilles' companion. He was kind and brave and foolish, and had worn Achilles' armor to inspire the Greek troops and had been killed for it. Priam was not just the old king. He was a father who had watched his sons die one by one, and had humbled himself to beg for his son's body from the man who had killed him. They were people, and as long as he remembers them as people, they remain people. They resist the simplification that time imposes on everyone, the reduction of lived complexity to narrative simplicity. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is the only meaning that matters. To witness, to remember, to carry the past forward into the future, to be the thread that connects what was to what might be, to refuse the easy closure of death and instead accept the difficult continuation of life. Achilles stands at the window and watches the sun set over Athens, over the land he has walked for 3,000 years, over the Mediterranean that carried Greek ships to Troy when the world was young, and knows that tomorrow the sun will rise again, and he will still be here, walking forward through time, carrying Troy within him like a flame that refuses to go out, a story that refuses to end, a memory that persists beyond all reasonable boundaries. He does not know if there is purpose in this continuation. He does not know if the universe cares whether he remembers or forgets. He only knows that he will be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, walking forward through a future unmarked by prophecy, unbounded by fate, infinite and lonely and strangely, quietly beautiful in its persistence, in its refusal to conclude, in its endless, eternal, exhausting, exhilarating embrace of life that continues, that persists, that flows like water around every obstacle, that bends but does not break, that carries forward through centuries and millennia, through the rise and fall of civilizations, through transformation and catastrophe, through moments of grace and moments of horror, through the endless, ordinary, extraordinary miracle of continued existence, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, moment by moment, day by day, year by year, century by century. Achilles continues, and the story does not end, because stories only end when there is no one left to tell them, and he is still here, still walking, still remembering, still carrying Troy forward into whatever future awaits.